welcome to the Grain Ring, and thanks for watching. This video is third in a group of 6 presenting a note-by-note analysis of Wagner's Das Rheingold Scene 3. Built on nearly 2 centuries of scholarly literature, its massive journey aspires to examine the entirety of Der Ring des Nibelungen to its final note. I hope you'll take this voyage with me, one I'm dedicated to completing. For an explanation of who I am and more on the reasons for this series, please check out my preface video. Its link is supplied below, along with those for the other videos preceding this one. We pick up where we left off in Dover's full score on the first stave of page 180, the end of Mima's dialogue with Loge and Wotan, just moments before Alberich parades his Nibelung slaves before them. Ended in hectic woodwinds, the peculiar Loge distortion puts a swift comic period to the god's chat with Mima, interrupted by a key change back into D-flat minor and 2 potent strophes of the Nibelung tattoo in violins, violas, mixed with servitude on low strings. The harmony rises precipitately to culminate in a double tattoo pulse, capped by a sting on the next downbeat. Over answering violin-viola tremolos, Mima warns of Alberich's approach. His static notes ended in reverse chord notes, and the word Alberich on a static ash interval capped by a rising third. Mima's caveat leading to another more hectic pair of tattoos and semiquavers strung with falling string twitches and woodwind trill appoggiatura. Horns interrupt with a pompous strophe of Valhalla Part 1. The ring fragments echo. As Wotan states, they'll await the dwarf ruler, his vocal dropping a third into a low ash interval on a noble air de fourth, only to end on a descending fifth atop a sly chord modulation, its final crotchet punctuated by the timpani's Valhalla ash interval, which leads the tonality into B-flat minor, what Darcy deems typical of Alberich and the Nibelung. A key that holds sway until the dialogue begins between the dwarf tyrant and his unwanted guests. Alberich enters to a masterful climactic passage of 15 measures, the first 6 confusing the tattoo by sounding it at a parallax between first violins, violas, and second violins. Beneath these initial chaotic measures, low strings 3 times growl servitude, only to quicken their pace to a pair per measure, each rising a fourth to heighten the tension. With the 7th measure, horns batter away on only the tattoo rhythm. Low strings pick up a wave-like variant on the graced octaves from Alberich's earlier torment of his dwarves, while violas oppose violins in pairs of servitude, a single measure of each against 2 of the Rhine Maiden's joy in its dire minor mode, all of it repeated while lifting harmonically across another 7 measures. All told, it's a development reminiscent of the Scene 2-3 interlude, now further illuminated by the octave strokes from the mini-interlude during Alberich's invisible tormenting, and the servitude air-to-chord mix from Mima's scena. All the while, Alberich shrieks imprecations at his dwarfish slaves heaping gold, an ever-clearer picture of how exposure to the ring warps them, not only mentally but physically. The dwarf's vocal begins on a series of chord notes in their servitude form, at a parallax with low strings at the point they quicken that morpheme's pace, each separated by quaver rests, the last a falling third. After a dotted quaver rest, his threats expand on what might be an intimation of fate, and, after another quaver rest, a distorted echo of Wotan's declaration of the ring's allure, then completes the phrase, after lifting a third, in a turn built from reverse erda and chord notes. After a rest of almost 2 measures, he leaps down a 4th and up a 6th, isolated cries whose double impact effect invokes the giant's outrage. After a crotchet quaver rest, he bellows a static ash interval, followed by an upward third to initiate a last pair of chord notes, in upper strings now reinforced by woodwinds, and a semi-quaver Loge-like rumble on low strings, which, in the measure's last half, becomes a rising scale reinforced on bass clarinet. All this leads to the passage's climactic bars, a blizzard of illuminating syntax, including in swift conjunction two modules evolving towards the very special parts they play throughout the epic in the emergent power struggle between dwarf and god. Alberich's initial vocal module is first heard embryonically when he woos Velgunda, reverberates in Fricka's Scene 2 accusations against Photon, and whose slightly altered form has only just crystallized into the oppressor dwarf's fearful threats of violence against his fellows. Here he repeats it twice, only to follow it with a version of Flosshilda's heroic cry, syntax which has already occurred numerous times in Rheingold vocals, always to suggest defensive resistance of some sort, even during the course of Loge's description of the giant's retreat with Freya. Its immediate opposition to its retrograde here leaves no doubt the two modules are retrograde versions of one another, a detail vital to defining their individual meanings. Alberich's text is another clue, abusing his slaves while exhibiting his own bravado. The orchestral mix, woodwinds and strings alone, adds to the passage's syntactic force. The obvious resemblance of the abusive module to the Nibelung tattoo, itself a derivation of the Rhine Maiden's joy, is reiterated to underline the passage as a development of the nymph's syntactic transformation during Loge's panegyric, back to which root can be traced the woes of both dwarves and gods. The more complete orchestral memory of the nymph's joy repeats 3 times for emphasis, only to truncate in the turn alone, which then rises in a series of 3 Welterbe triads, recalling Loge's Scene 2 picture of Alberich's power over the ring, as well as the racial distortion the dwarves suffer because of it. Adding to these hints, low strings support the sequence with 3 iterations of extended reverse melody notes, while emphasizing their more wanted 3-note version, all with growing racial connotations. In a final detail, a series of timpani and cymbal rolls add tension and color, while flutes piccolos surmount the texture with a series of 4 trill appoggiature. That, while adding glitter to the passage, also suggests the fetishistic pleasure the dwarf feels in tormenting his fellows. On another note, they also echo the god's lust for the ring in Scene 2. A cymbal roll crescendos during these measures to crash with a virtually full orchestral sting as Alberich notices the gods. The second part of his harangue proceeds by quieting yet intensifying the emotional heat with a continuous syncopated low woodwind pulse, a bit of foreshadowing to be explained in due course, but which harkens back to his Scene 1 abuse at the hands of the nymphs. Atop it, he pegs the gods with 3 static notes and a plunging tritone. Then, after timpani beat a Valhalla ash interval during a quaver crotchet rest, he challenges them to a low ash interval on a 3rd, which, his next note raised another 3rd after a quaver rest, sketches an abandonment triad. Realizing who's responsible for their access, he orders Mima to his side on a descending 7th and rising 3rd. After another lift of a 3rd produces a 2nd abandonment triad, the dwarf abuses his brother as a Schwabinger Schuft, ironically, with a ghost of the Rhine Maiden's happy taunts, whose Welterbe triad echoes his rising triad, an eerie reminiscence of Wotan's love letter to his own power bid in Scene 2. Never mind recalling Mima's immediately prior description of his Nibelung brethren's torments. It's given teeth by another Valhalla ash interval in timpani, after which Alberich follows these sporadic first ejaculations with a more sustained line scolding his errant brother away from these dangerous guests and back to the fold. Begun with a static ash interval, he drops a minor 6th into static notes, then rises a 3rd into another static interval capped by an upward 3rd, forming, not surprisingly, another abandonment triad. Joined by a timpani roll as his anger increases, Alberich plunges a 4th into more static notes, intones another static interval, lifts a 4th into more static notes, which he caps with a downward tritone as the low woodwind pulse intones a distorted ring strophe. He has reason to be annoyed, knowing the gods must now be privy to his secrets thanks to Mima. As the timpani roll intensifies, Alberich orders his slaves back to work in a flurry of 3 triplet semiquaver scales that ascend through the string choir, his vocal first bouncing on magisterial fourths, then 2 static ash intervals, the first capped by a descending fifth, the second a plunging octave, the 2 most dire intervals in the Wagnerian lexicon. On the heels of the last, contrabasses scuttle down a marcato semiquaver scale to initiate a passage in which the dwarf, his abuse particularly heated for the god's benefit, whips his minions back to their tasks, meaning their search for more gold to smelt into additional booty. This is obviously a show put on specifically for Wotan, and its syntactic contributions are acutely revealing as they pick up the orchestral texture from the immediately previous scolding. The passage is a fine example of this first chapter's hothouse compositional technique, a seemingly minor episode which continues hammering out syntax destined to acquire progressive meaning across the whole epic. Quick eyes and ears will recognize this as an adapted reprise of Alberich's scramble after the Rhine Maidens in Scene 1, though its haste there morphs to fury here, underlining how the dwarf's sexual frustration has exploded into pure yet purposeful rage. Alberich's personal morpheme, complete with its arid chords, sets up an undulating down-up sign with its overlapping up-down echo. While this is true in its Scene 1 incarnation, it's only here the syntax flattens into something very like the giant turn, which in Scene 2 opposes the gods during Loge's theft advice, a still more potent hint at the role those modules play in control of the ring. As with his Scene 1 scramble, the Alberich morpheme alternates with reverse melody notes, though here they increase from 1 pulse to 3, while supported by cellos outlining abandonment triads. This fits together with the passage when, cloaked in the Tarnhelm, Alberich torments his dwarves, his abuse unfolding orchestrally in a long chain of those same reverse melody notes marching down low brass strings, for which the current sequence provides clarification. Underscored by contrabass octaves leaping up-down, much as they do in that earlier sequence, not to mention recalling the dwarf as he first lusts after the nymphs, the episode rises to its height on repeated hammer-stroke variants of the Welterbe triad. This one brief but pungent episode collects 3 modules, which are the backbone of the coming racial strife between Alberich and Wotan as it spreads across the remainder of the tetralogy. In performance, audiences can hardly be expected to decode so complex a web, but it's a fertile indication of the Meister's thought processes as he worked towards his finished syntax. The dwarf's vocal is equally rich in syntactic clues, ones which are more likely to strike audiences on a conscious level. His first 2 phrases echo one another, each launched by a cell adapting the Alberich morpheme into Fafnir's threat against the gods' immortality, as it strikes home once Freya has been taken from them, while both strophes finish on Flosshilda's heroic phrase. The vocal continues in another 3 echoing pulses of static notes ended by chord notes, the last 2 iterations with static ash intervals, the whole rounded off by another pulse of the Threat of Aging module. Taken together, all these syntactic elements paint an unrelenting picture of the dwarf whipping his race into a heroically fearsome host bent on robbing the gods of their immortality, and it's no accident he ratchets up his game now he finds them watching. The way in which Alberich and his brethren interact is bound to open the immortal's eyes, a mirror opposite of Wotan's relations with Loge and his fellow gods. Though detestable, Alberich is his people's absolute master, while Wotan seems to be no one's, least of all Loge's. In this upside-down world of evil, Alberich the Brute dominates Mima the Pathetic, who, though scheming to gain the upper hand, lacks the wherewithal to do it, whose relationship indicts the immortal as the weaker party in his own dealings. As events in Nibelheim unfold before Wotan, again and again he sees his enemy wield in the darkness that irresistible power the god is so far patently unable to exercise in the light. He can't help but envy the dwarf and ponder what this means to his own hopes for world conquest. In short, Wotan's mind is in flux, portrayed in music that allots the god little of his own syntactic material during Scene 3. Instead, it's what he assimilates which shapes the evolving syntax of his future struggles against Alberich. The furious dwarf caps his peroration with that impressive module from his earlier abuse of his fellow dwarves, rising into it vocally with the low-ash interval on a fourth, atop two more violin triad strophes, and a furious semi-quaver giant turn on first violins. This time he makes it personal to Mima, who knows his power of invisibility firsthand, a warning Alberich shapes with a low-ash interval on reverse chord notes, which he concludes punctuated by two forceful woodwind string quaver chords, anticipated first by a rising, then a falling demi-semi-quaver violin-viola scale. His voice plunging an octave, then descending on extended reverse melody notes, molded in the form of a pair of chord notes, yet another module slowly acquiring meaning in relation to Alberich's overall menace. We are again urged to think of Wotan observing and learning from the way in which his nemesis controls his dwarfish folk, yet another hint as to where all this embryonic syntax must inevitably lead. Low strings follow the dwarf's threat, as amid a low woodwind brass pedal they growl down semi-quavers in a chromatic scale to end on a threatening quasi-Loge rumble. These two dramatic wordless measures suggest audiences are meant to pay close attention to what follows, that being Alberich's ultimate act of terrorism, one of the pivotal musico-dramatic landmarks in the Ring, coalescing into itself so much of what's come before. This is, after all, that moment the Ring itself makes its first on-stage appearance, its malignant debut prefaced by cementing key syntactic cues from the previous section. Alberich sings two consecutive a cappella iterations of a more concise version of his abuse, falling tritones intact, modules whose importance is emphasized by their separation with fermatas. Unlike most of their forebears, however, these solidify their future versions by reducing their rising notes to 3, meaning melody notes, much as they've been heard in earlier vocals. Low brass middle woodwinds then breathe the Ring in its purest form, underpinned by timpani roll, its last note replaced in a hissing cymbal roll, swelling towards crescendo, that leads to the operative syntax, a new morpheme built from a pair of ertachords in woodwind's horns on the lowest tuba, followed by the Rhine maiden's turn. At this point, low brass take over completely, to end by rising with swelling threat on melody notes. The Nibelung's vocal is direct and simple, bouncing almost entirely on thirds through a pair of static ash intervals and too low to end on a heroic rising fifth, the dwarf's crowning phrase therefore being another echo of Wotan's lust for the Ring's power. As minor but notable details, timpani punctuate with Valhalla ash intervals, one of them doubled in cymbals, while trombones oppose the melody's last two notes with another chord iteration. The operative heart of this threatening syntax, Cook names Power of the Ring, then as much as acknowledges it's an evolution of the ertachords by calling it a minor mode version of the Rhine maiden's Joy in the Gold. Oddly, it's not universally recognized, while those analysts who discuss it prefer a variety of names. Volkswagen calls it Alberich's triumphant cry, Kobe seems unaware of it, and Newman disdains any name. Hutchison prefers the spell of the Ring, while Donington pays it no mind. Holman accepts Cook's moniker and strengthens its roots in the ertachords by citing their presence here as Cook's servitude. Spencer Millington tacitly implied the ertachord notes are its sole operative syntax, though Millington corrects that misapprehension somewhat in his earlier Wagner treatise. Meanwhile, Sabor views it as two different morphemes. Its Erda chords he styles as grief, thinking of them only as the chord notes, thus again inadvertently emphasizing the syntax's roots in Erda. Its extension he dubs Gold's Dominion, though his rationale must await this commentary's discussion of Götterdämmerung. The stage action is simplicity itself. Alberich kisses, then holds out his almighty bauble as he orders his dwarves to obey its lord, which moves them to disperse, screaming. Cook bases his name solely on the import of this, its first appearance, which, given the fearsome reaction it inspires, he reasons is symbolic of a generic power for enslavement. While his Précis explains the morpheme well enough during Rheingold, there's a great deal more involved, about which some mention should be made at the outset. After Rheingold, the morpheme rarely accompanies stage events or text involving the ring itself, but instead falls more firmly in place with the overall connotations of the Erda chords. These, whenever they sound in major, minor, or even discord, roughly connote something akin to natural energy, both animate and inanimate, physical and psychological, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. It is the totality of being channeled into its many forms through Erda's creative dreams, in effect the life force. Even here, associated with the ring's evil, at the most fundamental level the syntax arises from Erda. Its minor mode brutally contrasts with the Rhine Maiden's bright major version, but, as Holman observes, the power of gold ends in major mode, though he doesn't note the texture then plunges immediately back into minor, the Erda-centric minor-major-minor parallax which so notably permeates Loge's music, and which sounds here with stunning authority. Tied to the awesome racial change in progress, ever more dense bowed semiquaver strings develop the Nibelung's retreat from the reverse melody notes of Alberich's several perorations, a raging climactic ascent driven by the continual tam-tam roll. After 4 measures, strings rise on 2 measures of Loge's chromatic scale into 2 which muddle all these elements into a sinuous giant turn distortion. Then, as timpani roll replaces tam-tam, top off in 8 frantic measures of progressively sinking ring fragment pulses, sustained by a gradually attenuating woodwind horn tuba pedal. At its bottom, it's replaced by the Nibelung tattoo on horns violas mixed with bassoon tuba chord note strophes Cook's servitude to fade on tattoo and timpani roll alone. In short, this retreat is built entirely from sonic marks of the dwarves' mutation through their exposure to the ring's twisted power. Wotan has imagined his own sort of regimented world, one obedient to him but coerced peaceably by law in the form of his spear, in other words, the kind of plan he's already attempted with the giants. Yet he, a god, must literally sink to the depths in order to clinch that deal, where he finds a malign dwarf succeeds in doing through evil what he cannot do through good. Wotan's subsequent words and behavior suggest he rationalizes Alberich's triumph as not an effect of perverted natural power, meaning the ring, but rather strictly its wielder's venality. In short, like so many despots through the ages, the god misses the forest for the trees in an attempt to rationalize away his own baser motivations. Wotan has no choice if he's to justify his iniquity, since the ring's baleful energy is exactly what he's made this journey to acquire for himself, and worse, by theft. Now he's seen its malign power at work, the god sets to his task, or rather, he disdainfully stands back while Loge's craft achieves his ends. Before moving on, some words must be said of this passage's treatment in production. The ring itself, the epic's namesake, is most often explained away as no more than a symbol of greed, and staging's usually treated as Alfred Hitchcock's MacGuffin, an item largely unseen and unexplained whose only role is being what everyone wants to possess. Going by the libretto, the ring is out of sight from the end of Rheingold until Siegfried, Act 2, and when it returns, the tale seems to have forgotten its importance, something which has bred much confusion over the years. The problem is how to wed the syntax's remarkable impact with visuals which forge an associative link muscular enough to survive the ring's visual absence during the entirety of Valkyr, and the first act and a half of Siegfried. The difficulty can't be laid entirely at the Meister's door, however, as illustrated by the way in which various stagings approach this, its first appearance, in relation to the music supporting it. Wagner's orchestration suggests that he envisioned more being done with the ring than what's found in his limited stage instructions. The figure isolates its unusual use of percussion for a reason, placing together on their own stave the cymbals and exotic tam-tam, a Chinese gong whose tone cuts deeper than traditional ones, its reverberations more sustained. As noted, the instrument combines with a pair of cymbal rolls to give the sequence a powerful edge, whose swell punctuates the syntax's zenith. After the cymbals fall silent, the tam-tam roll continues during the Nibelung's retreat, building to an inexorable climax, as if the ring's energy intensifies unbearably before the dwarves' eyes, then drives them away in agony. Despite this, most productions give so much stage to their panic supernumeraries, the sequence teeters on the comical. Nibelungs must have highly refined sensibilities if the mere sight of greed throws them into paroxysms of horror. "Touchy little beggars," snorts Kriebel's doubter. Of the mountings readily available on video, only 2 attempt to grapple this puzzle. Kupfer's 2005 Barcelona version disperses its Nibelungs with random light flashes in the background, a striking, if diffuse, effect. 2012's Argentina isolates Alberich at the climactic moment in a stark overhead spotlight, fist and ring held high. Tangentially, productions tend not to give the ring prop itself much visual presence, while those who do so enjoy minimal success. Valencia's ring is a fist-sized plastic hoop with small flashing lights rather like a glow stick, which slant Argentina takes, if differently designed. Copenhagen's device, half jewelry, half scientific instrument, has been discussed, while Kupfer's 2005 mounting takes its boldest approach. A bejeweled, almost hand-sized crown worn atop the fist, its ring is easily seen at a distance, but with the unfortunate effect of looking rather like gaudy brass knuckles. Lastly, no production mentioned, excepting possibly Vienna in 2016, follows Wagner's directions for Alberich to trigger the ring's powers by kissing it. This last detail is more important even than the ring's design. The traditional view of a greed symbol has led most productions to ignore the talisman's magical properties, despite the poem's numerous references to them. In my view, a truly creative staging would make the physical ring prop only so prominent as to facilitate audiences in locating it those few times it's important to be recognized on a wearer's hand. By far the more crucial